The film opens on a shot of an egg yolk being injected with a syringe, and then a separate second egg yolk emerges from the first one. This illustrates to the viewer what the substance does, and that's important for all of the typical good screenwriting reasons. It foreshadows what's to come. It makes sure the audience is clear about the function of this sci-fi technology so that they'll be less confused later on. But what I also like about starting the film off with this imagery is that it seems so much like a demonstration, both in the sense of a scientific demonstration, but also a product demonstration. Scientists have to demonstrate the efficacy of some technology they've developed by testing it out on non-human subjects first. Obviously, the alternative is worse, to test unknown experimental chemicals out on human beings. Before you have any idea how it works would be cruel and unusual, but this does carry a distancing effect.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
These scientists spend enough time testing the substance on egg yolks that then when they see one yolk pop out of the other one, it's a triumph. That's watching a miracle happen before your eyes. They get so excited about that, and it becomes easier to lose sight of the fact that performing this miracle on an egg yolk says very little about what the effect might be on a living, conscious human being. It calls to mind the thing when a product is being advertised to you by showing its effectiveness on some inanimate other object. Oh wow, I really need to buy this concealer because look at how well it covers up the spots on that banana peel. But my skin is not a banana peel. Why not show the product being used on actual human skin? And more interestingly, why does that seem to psychologically work better to see the concealer on the banana peel and not on the human skin? My theory is that it's all about the abstraction. A close-up of skin could reveal imperfections, even with the concealer applied, that makes me less likely to want the product. But I don't recognize something like a wrinkle, a pore, a blemish on the banana peel with the same shame-guided repulsion as I've been trained by the media to view human skin with. And thus, these ads are also implicitly asking us to abstract ourselves and our own bodies by doing this. Are you starting to see why I feel this might be relevant to some of the themes in this movie? For many people, the "this is your brain on drugs" PSA might come to mind. This is something I noticed in many examples of Fargeat's symbolism. She understands that symbols evolve. When she uses symbolism, I notice that the symbolic meaning often works not only in its most basic, timeless form, but also in the referential, pop culture-driven way that certain images remind the audience of certain things because of something they grew up watching on TV or seeing on the internet. She does this without ever feeling too referential. It never feels like she's pointing at it and yanking on your sleeve like, look, it's a thing you recognize from some other thing. Don't you recognize that? The egg yolk is more primordially a symbol of life in its most fragile possible infancy, a symbol of fertility, a symbol of endless potential. Fargeat is utilizing the semiotic power of all of those connotations, but she also recognizes that this is a movie released in the year 2024, drenched in a 1980s aesthetic. What the egg yolk connotes to someone in ancient times is not the same thing as what it might connote to a contemporary viewer. I see this, and sure, I'm like, yeah, I get it, it represents, like, life or whatever. But in my mind, I also hear, this is your brain on drugs. But for me or any other viewer to be reminded of that is not distracting, nor does it contradict the intended meaning. Instead, it further serves the intended meaning. The purpose of that particular 1987 anti-drug campaign, and the reason why it's become so memorable and absorbed into the collective consciousness, is because it's such an overt analogy. It really hits you over the head. But that's because it's incredibly clear and direct as a means of explaining to you why you shouldn't do drugs. By doing so, you're going to scramble your fucking brains like a fried egg. Do you get it now? Of course you do. It couldn't be more clear. So it's interesting to see something similar recontextualized in this way. Instead of warning you not to do something, this is somehow supposed to entice you? It's supposed to make you want to do this particular drug? You're seeing right in front of your eyes a ridiculously unsubtle illustration of how this drug will defile your body, the egg in this analogy. And yet that's instead being touted as some revolutionary miracle of modern medicine that you simply must get your hands on as soon as possible. I feel that's a dichotomy that we see played with heavily in this film. On one end we have the harmful, the disfiguring, the grotesque, the abominable. On the other end we have the restorative, the rejuvenating, the beautiful, the pure. And we see how our perceptions of this are warped radically simply by how those things are presented to us. I know we're still only on the first shot of the movie, so I'll pick up the pace a little. But one final thing I want to say about the egg yolk imagery is that it's also effective because it's sort of yucky. A seed, for example, has a similar symbolic connotation as an egg, but that wouldn't be as gross, and the grossness is important. It needs to be slimy and goopy. It needs to make a little bit of a mess. And speaking of making a mess, that's another important detail about this shot. Someone just broke an egg directly on the tabletop. There's no little petri dish or anything. There easily could and probably should be a little petri dish, at least. So I feel this was an intentional artistic choice for the purpose of heightening that unsettling egg factor. Even without being consciously aware of it, the viewer might have an unpleasant reaction to seeing this because in their own kitchen, they would never do this for fear of not only making a mess, but salmonella contamination. But it might also hint at the carelessness of these scientists. They're being reckless with the safety and well-being of their consumers, and we see immediately a symbolic representation of this through the fact that they were apparently like, fuck it, just break the egg right on the table, who gives a shit? The next thing we see after the egg is a time-lapse of our protagonist's Hollywood star. This film is packed with visual storytelling. Definitely don't watch this movie if you're just going to be on your phone the whole time. Watching this sequence, I was following the exposition given by it, but I was also trying to acclimate to the particular tone and narrative style of this film. I was trying to figure out what to expect. That's an important part of the viewer experience at the beginning of any film, and something that we should probably all try to be a little bit more conscious of. When you watch a new movie for the first time, you're gradually learning and figuring out how you're meant to react. There's a gnat in here. When you watch a new movie for the first time, you're gradually learning and figuring out how you're meant to react, and what the movie is going for, so to speak. This is especially important in art with any level of satire and/or camp. Anything involving the Hollywood star with this movie is a bit camp, and that's especially clear at the end. It's hard to call anything about this sequence clever, because I feel like if you ask someone, how could you show the rise and fall of a celebrity in a 2-minute scene without any dialogue? This is like the most obvious fucking answer. And yet, I wasn't put off by it or rolling my eyes at it, because I was starting to figure out that that's simply the style of this filmmaker. I will admit that when I first watched this film, during the first act, the whole topic of this particular video, I wasn't entirely sold yet on this style. It felt a little bit like the movie was just ticking off boxes, including all the little scenes and moments you need to establish what's going on with this character. She overhears her boss saying appalling things about her. She gazes at herself in the mirror and looks sad. She sees a casting call for her explicitly hotter and younger replacement. It all felt very on the nose and somewhat uninspired. I felt like I would have been able to connect even more with Elizabeth and identify further with what she's going through if this exposition had all felt slightly less filmic and instead more intimate and naturalistic. Maybe she sees photos she took for a promotional image such as that billboard, and then she sees how heavily her image has been retouched to the point where she no longer even looks like the same person. Maybe she goes to a consultation for a minor cosmetic surgery, just a little tweak, and she begins to feel overwhelmed by the doctor's pushiness about all the procedures she could get. Those are probably pretty predictable scenes also, but I'm just saying that I think a bit more subtlety and showing the death by 1,000 cuts that eats away at your confidence and self-love might be more effective for the start of this film. However, it's funny because when I went back and watched this opening after I had totally fallen in love with the movie the first time I saw it, I didn't have any of these thoughts anymore. So I think this really is just a matter of whether or not you're on board with the heightened reality of this storytelling, and at this point I'm very much on board with that. The juxtaposition with cutting from the egg to the star, both framed identically, is probably supposed to prompt us to draw parallels between the two images. The star sequence starts from the beginning. We see the blank square of pavement, and then we see in detail as the star is constructed, the cement poured, the letters affixed to spell out the name Elizabeth Sparkle. To me, I feel the link between the two images here is about the act of creation. The egg yolk is not only a symbol of life, but also of unlimited potential, as I mentioned. It's specifically about the creation of life. One yolk splitting off from the other is visually reminiscent of cells dividing. We all start off as a tiny little cell that splits off into another cell and then another, until eventually a whole person is created. With this rise and fall of a star story, we get the sense that Elizabeth was at her best when she was in this state of unlimited potential, when she was a young up-and-comer who could do anything, be anything. What she becomes is not bad. She's still successful and rich and beautiful, but even that is not as good or as flashy as unlimited potential. Later in the film, some significance is given to the notion that Dennis Quaid's character created her, or created Sue. So it's worth noting also that we see Elizabeth here as a formless, dormant yolk, just waiting to be created by these powerful men, which is a denial of her own agency and personhood. She did not create herself. She did not create her success. She does not create her destiny. The Hollywood Walk of Fame itself is all about creating a symbol out of a person. You could argue there's something here about the dwindling of old Hollywood glamour in general. Food mess is a motif throughout this movie. The sequence ends with some guy dropping his food all over her star. The symbolism is clear, but it's also not the same thing as if someone had dropped food all over a famous painting or a religious altar or a grave. This concept of her star being desecrated is somewhat silly, since it's not sacred to begin with. I'm not sure to what extent this sequence is intentionally making the point that it's silly to treat something like a Hollywood Walk of Fame star as something sacred, but I feel like that should be at least part of the point. Next, we cut to Elizabeth's jazzercise and Jane Fonda-inspired aerobics show. I'm struck by how not pornographic Sparkle Your Life feels compared to the later Pump It Up. Elizabeth's original aerobics show does look just pretty typically like what you would expect for one of those workout tapes that were super popular in the 80s and 90s. She tells her audience, think about those bikini buns, you want to look like a jellyfish on the beach? Her job is about using shame to motivate her viewers to exercise. And that shit is so insidious because, I hate exercising and I need a lot of motivation to do that. I know that my own motivation to exercise is the highest when I feel the worst about how I look. I've gone to plenty of classes at the gym where some perky little fitness instructor is saying stuff like this. So I know that there's something about being sweaty and exhausted and then being told by someone with a better body than yours that you need to just keep on pushing, which can incite a certain level of animosity and rage, even in someone who normally never feels that way. There are very few instances when I'm interacting with another woman and the thought, fuck you, you bitch, goes through my mind legitimately, but that very situation can bring that out in me. This film deals with misogyny heavily, but it deals almost equally with the way that women hate other women. For the reason I just described, I think that centering Elizabeth/Sue's career around this jazzercise-esque programming could not be any more perfect or appropriate. I'm curious if Coralie Fargeat is aware of the Apple TV show Physical. It's interesting that there have now been at least 2 examples I'm aware of where this 80s jazzercise aerobics programming is used as a backdrop to explore issues of women's body dysmorphia and self-esteem. Probably because, as I said, it's the absolute perfect backdrop for that, for many reasons I'll probably get into more when we get to Sue's Pump It Up program. Not to mention, as much as I'm morally opposed to the psychological implications of this, I also can't deny my love for this particular aesthetic. The spandex leotards and the synthwave soundtracks are a vibe. It's fun to see this aesthetic mixed up with a ton of visceral B-movie horror effects. I have a fascination with VHS, so I can't overlook the reach that these exercise tapes had within the world of home video. But for me, that VHS era is also synonymous with a lot of campy, sleazy horror movies, so it's really cool to see those two things smashed together. There's a few examples like Killer Workout, Body Melt, Death Spa, the more recent Murder Size, but overall, I've never seen something that takes full advantage of this premise. Even with the substance, it takes full advantage of the premise for the sake of the social message, but I kinda wish we could have seen more stuff like when Sue is on set filming, and there's that freaky lump inside her butt cheek. All I'm saying is that I wouldn't have said no to some dream sequence where we see Monstro Eliza Sue in neon leg warmers. Elizabeth also says, next week we're going to work on those lateral abs, the most difficult area to sculpt. I'm no fitness expert, but I'm pretty sure that when it comes to abs, it's more about what you eat than doing a bunch of crunches or whatever. Again, I don't know enough about fitness, but the phrasing of this makes me think this is supposed to be a critique of the way that harmful misinformation and names for highly specific parts of your body are used to invent new areas of excessive self-scrutiny. It's like the workout's designed to get rid of your hip dips. I think the catchphrase sign-off thing of, but in the meantime, take care of yourself, and then blowing a kiss is probably important because we see it again with Sue, except framed in a more sinister way. All I can think of as far as the deeper meaning behind this is that it plays into the contrast between self-care and self-harm that we see so much throughout this movie. The cutesy, smug manner of saying that and then literally blowing a kiss and winking at the audience makes it seem more like a veiled threat than encouragement. It's like she's saying, I know I just made you feel ashamed of your body for the past hour, but you better keep that shame in the back of your head all throughout this upcoming week, so that you don't accidentally slip up and undo all of our hard work here by eating a slice of cake or something. This movie is also a masterclass in the importance of understanding how and why certain scenes are shot for the purpose of creating a certain effect. particularly when it comes to establishing that feeling of tension and apprehension. It wouldn't make sense to film the initial sparkle your life scene in any unsettling horror movie way. I think sometimes even good horror filmmakers with a strong vision and good ideas can fail in this regard, because they think it's like beneath them or something, to have part of their film's runtime look too cheesy, or too reminiscent of something which seems lame to them. But no, in order for the contrast to be the most impactful, we need scenes like this to actually look like what it's a parody of. Don't be shy about getting a little silly with it. This movie is perfectly willing to get a little silly with it, and I love it all the more for that. Everyone Elizabeth passes knows it's her birthday and tells her happy birthday. Granted, these aren't her quote real friends, they're still only doing this because she's the star of the show they all work for. But I still think it's worth noting that most of the passing interactions we see between Elizabeth and people who aren't Harvey do make it seem like she is still well liked by her fans. In the doctor's office, the doctor says, "My wife is a huge fan." I feel like the point is that it's almost like she doesn't hear all of this affection and admiration. There are far fewer voices of criticism and contempt, but that voice screams the loudest. I saw a comparison between this hallway and the one from The Shining, which, yeah, it does sort of look like that. But I'll speak in a moment about the homages in this movie. The character of her repulsive boss, Harvey, was going to be played by Ray Liotta, who was replaced because he literally died of natural causes during production. The point is very much supposed to be that this character is a withered up old dinosaur who has no business criticizing Demi Moore. Kudos to Dennis Quaid for having the humility to play this role. I mean, hey, he's looking great for a 70-year-old dude, but damn, the way he's filmed in this is not flattering. All the close-ups of his wrinkly face and harsh, unforgiving lighting really drive home the notion that Elizabeth looks like a goddess compared to him, and yet she's held to a far more impossible standard than he is. Big kudos to Demi Moore as well. I'll get into that more during some of the scenes where I was shaken to my core by the absolute fearlessness of her performance. But this woman is a badass, and I admire the hell out of her for doing this role and giving it 1,000% like she did. This is a career best performance for her, for sure. Demi Moore mentioned in an interview that she was unfamiliar with this genre, but it occurred to me that this film might actually harken back to her first major role ever, a cheap, tasteless, and gross B-movie called Parasite. She's done work of a much higher prestige and classiness since then, but I think it's an interesting statement about high art and low art, what roles are considered beneath an actor, what determines your status as a has-been versus what creates your personal renaissance, and other topics like that. Especially when considering that I was infinitely more affected by this performance where she vomits up her own tit than I was by something like the melodrama of Ghost. Let's talk a bit about how hyperbolically vile and repulsive Harvey's comments about Elizabeth are. It seems so over the top, and some viewers might have an issue with that, but I just kept getting the feeling that it works because the comments made by men about women in real life are often just as bad or worse. I happened to make a Twitter account shortly before I started working on this video, and encountered a tweet that was going semi-viral at the time, where someone was complaining about Kirsten Dunst's face. I'm not even going to show the tweet here because I don't want to give it any more attention than it's already gotten. It's also just one example out of literally infinite examples. Even in comment sections for videos about this very film, you can often find plenty of ageist and sexist remarks towards Demi Moore, Margaret Qualley, and even Coralie Fargeat. I watched an interview with Fargeat where she said some tremendously poignant things about her purpose and intention in making this movie. But she was wearing this cute, sort of pleathery shirt, and mind you, no cleavage, nothing flashy, and still someone watched that interview or heard all of the thought-provoking things she was saying, and decided to comment simply, "She looks so good in leather." It's like, how deeply fucking disturbed do you have to be to still not get the point, even when you're beaten over the head with it? How can you look at someone who I now consider to be a true genius and visionary, and still you're going to prioritize the vaguest possible resemblance she bears to some creepy dominatrix fetish you have over her staggering achievement as a filmmaker and as an artist? It is literally fucking impossible to be a woman. I'm not trying to start any drama, but I have to admit that I think sometimes certain movies and TV shows do go over the top with trying to make a male character, or men in general, just the most egregious, horrible sexist pig you could possibly imagine. What I'm realizing though is that maybe those scripts are just not taking it far enough. Dennis Quaid's character is literally named Harvey. Fargeat knew that that was the opposite of subtle or clever, but it's bolder to be so in-your-face about it. Why are we making these parody versions of Harvey Weinstein, but stopping short of just straight-up naming the character Harvey? That motherfucker is evil. Why the hell are we doing him the courtesy of not dragging his actual name through the mud? It's mentioned that Elizabeth has won an Oscar, In the same conversation, Harvey says, "Did you know that a woman's fertility starts to decrease around the age of 25? A woman could reach some of the highest possible achievements in her field and still be reduced to her viability as a childbearer more than anything else." And again, maybe someone heard that line of dialogue and thought, nobody really talks like that. Yes, they do. I don't really keep up on celebrity culture and tabloids because it's all such trash, but isn't it a thing that the tabloids were, and maybe still are, fixated on when Jennifer Aniston or Taylor Swift or many other examples are going to finally have a baby? In the infamous shrimp eating scene, Harvey says,
"People always ask for something new."
I think this narrative is harmful, though. It's one of those things where we repeat it often enough that everybody just starts to accept it and believe it. And then you get situations where someone might cheat on their spouse of 20 years because that's just human nature. I think you could just as easily argue that there's a psychological need for the familiar. If people always want something new, then why are most big movies and TV shows nowadays based on existing media? All I'm saying is that if you're going to justify your infidelity based on this so-called human need, you should be banned from buying a movie ticket to any remake or sequel. Tell him, "Oh, well, we just figured you wouldn't be interested in this movie, because of how deeply you yearn for something new." Harvey says, at 50, well, it stops. She asks him what it is, and he never gives a clear answer. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what it is either. The topical noun in the preceding sentence is renewal, so maybe it is supposed to be renewal. Since he mentioned fertility previously, it might have something to do with that. The average age that a woman in the US starts menopause is 52, so it could be that. He gestures around in a way that I can only describe as euphemistically obscene, and then conveniently avoids answering her by seeing an acquaintance of his to yell across the restaurant at. His gestures make it seem like he's evoking, the firmness of a boob or something, so I think he's speaking more broadly about her sexual desirability in general. My interpretation is that it's purposeful that the "it" is left unspecified in this way, because the point is that he's some idiot asshole who has no idea what he's talking about. It's reminiscent of clips where a dude on a podcast will say some quote-unquote fact about women with the utmost confidence, as if it's some kind of mic drop moment, and they're oblivious to the fact that they're just parroting and perpetuating some sexist myth with no basis in reality. All of this is to say, again, I do not feel it's unrealistic for Harvey to say things like this. The "it" is never specified because Quaid's character is a moron who doesn't know what he's talking about. But I believe it's also left unspecified because by "it" he kind of means everything. It is not merely her fertility or her sexual desirability, it's everything about her. It's her life, it's her as a human being. Because in his mind there is nothing about her, her life ceases to exist, and she ceases to exist once she's arrived at some arbitrary number at which he can deem her completely sexually obsolete. It doesn't even really need to be pointed out, because I'm sure you picked up on this, but the shrimp eating is very purposefully sickening and excessive. Again, I believe this is meant to portray him in a grotesque way in order to emphasize the appalling hypocrisy and double standard of how he treats Elizabeth. But even in that, I want to be careful not to make it seem like I'm conflating beauty or youth with any kind of inherent purity or goodness. It's not like, oh, look at this wrinkly, ugly old bastard. He's a villain and he's evil because he's all wrinkly and ugly, and the way he eats shrimp is really gross. Whereas Demi Moore is good and pure because she's so much prettier than he is. There's no virtue or moral achievement in one person having better, prettier genes than another person, and it's important that we're clear on that. The grotesqueness of the way he looks and talks and eats is not inherently what makes him monstrous. It's merely the outward manifestation of the injustice that he is allowed to be unseemly in a way that she is not. This motherfucker eats so many shrimps during this meal. There's gotta be 50 or more shrimp skins all over the table. All we see of Elizabeth's meal is a single glass of wine that she didn't even drink. As far as why the wine glass has a fly in it, I know that a lot of people are probably like, oh, that's a nod to the 1986 Cronenberg masterpiece, The Fly, because body horror. And sure, but what I noticed is that often the food and beverages that one considers to be fancy, extravagant, and expensive are portrayed in this gross and unsettling way. The shrimp is disgusting. Later on, when Elizabeth is cooking all that fine French cuisine, it's fucking disgusting. That could have easily been a $50 glass of wine, and now it's undrinkable because it has a fly in it. I saw a comment for this film which annoyed me that said something like, "Can everyone stop pretending that the cinematography in this is anything original? Just stealing from Stanley Kubrick, David Cronenberg, John Carpenter, Stuart Gordon, etc." I would have more of a problem with that if it was like the entire movie was just trying to mimic exactly the style of another director's movie. It's not, though. Fargeat is creating a pastiche of many different styles. Kubrick does not own the concept of a red hallway. When you think body horror, you think Cronenberg. That's just the way it is. So, what? Does that mean that anybody who makes a body horror movie is automatically ripping off of Cronenberg? Men. I'm just kidding, I love him. I hope he stops, though. To me, the important thing that Fargeat does with the visual style of this film is to create unique contrasts. I've seen Yuzna movies, but I've never seen something that looks like a Yuzna movie one second and then looks like a Sofia Coppola movie the next second. And of course, that in itself is also not inherently clever, meaningful, or inventive. You can't just throw a bunch of stuff you've borrowed from other people into a blender and then use, "but it's pastiche," as a defense against any and all criticisms. But that's not what Fargeat does with the substance. These contrasts of styles become clever, meaningful, and inventive because they're saying something. This film is not merely style without... Do I even have to say it? I would also argue that it's important for Fargeat to make homages to directors like Cronenberg, Gordon, Carpenter, Yuzna, and others. She could have gone further with it, honestly. The reason I say this is because I'm a woman who adores sick and twisted cult cinema, and I am sick and tired of the notion that those movies are not for me. Those are movies for men. Bullshit. When I first learned about Fargeat, I genuinely felt so validated, so represented, so inspired. I felt both that, wow, she's just like me feeling, and that, wow, I want to be just like her feeling, more than any artist or person that I've encountered in a long time. I know Fargeat will never see this, but if I could say one thing to her, I'd apologize for mispronouncing her name, but then I would also say how much I appreciate, admire, and look up to her. I make it a point to avoid idolizing any celebrities or artists too much because they're just people and you don't truly know them. But damn, the more I learn about Coralie Fargeat, the more I'm thinking this might be my hero. Elizabeth is driving and she sees a billboard of herself being torn down, and then she's so fixated on it that she gets in a car accident. The significance of this is pretty clear, I think. She needs to stop fixating on herself and her image, or it will lead to her own violent destruction. It very nearly did just then, and the fact that she survives should be taken as a warning. Sometimes there are weird coincidences like this where something is just a little too on the nose for it to not be a sign from the universe, and so it serves as a wake-up call and motivates you to make a change in your life. But let's be real, we use a different interpretive sense when we're watching a movie than we use for our real lives. Because in a movie, everything does mean something. We are typically not shown something with no significance, whether literal or symbolic, to the movie. By the way, I'd argue that one of the main qualities of a bad movie, which makes it a bad movie, can be measured by how much content in the film is inexplicable and does not serve any larger significance. It's something we have literally no reason to be shown. That's not the only quality that can make something a bad movie, but I feel like that's a big one. Anyways, my point is that it's easy for us as viewers to act like it's so obvious what the unsubtle moral lesson of this situation is. But most of us probably don't pass by billboards of ourselves every day. If you were Elizabeth and you were accustomed to just seeing your face everywhere, there's a very good chance that you might not pick up on the irony that you were so worried about seeing your face torn off that you I gotta stop saying very nearly. There's a very good chance that you might not pick up on the irony that you were so worried about seeing your face torn off that you easily could have just gotten your face torn off. In Elizabeth's mind, this probably doesn't register as much else besides, Jesus Christ, I'm having the worst fucking day. My boss is a prick, I'm probably gonna get fired, I'm a starlet past her prime, I got in a car wreck, and they're taking my billboard down? If we're going to read into the symbolic significance of this and treat it as some kind of sign from the universe, or otherwise a capital M message with a capital M meaning, I've got another interpretation I might as well toss in here. I don't think this is what the movie was going for, but maybe there is some warning that could be taken here about the perils of being too self-consumed. The film is so focused on Elizabeth's self-image and self-destruction that we probably won't think about it this way, but this is one point in the movie where we see Elizabeth causing harm to someone other than herself. Elizabeth nearly kills herself in this accident, but we know literally nothing about what happened to the other driver. For all we know, this accident that she caused by looking at the billboard could have killed the other driver. And I know what you're thinking. Well, if that happened, there would have been some legal aftermath of this shown on screen. But I don't know. For a satire like this, it wouldn't be out of the question for a total lack of any repercussion to be the film's way of commenting on the fact that there are celebrities who are very famous still, despite killing regular people in something like a car accident. Because that's the power given to you by fame, thus highlighting another reason why Elizabeth would be so desperate to keep that power. Because it does literally give you power that the rest of the world lacks. Again, I don't think the movie is trying to say this, it's just something that occurred to me, and I feel like it would actually fit really well if this was the case. Furthermore, this film is focused on Elizabeth's self-destruction, but there's a point that could be made that self-loathing is still egotism. You're hating yourself and blowing all of your flaws out of proportion, whereas some arrogant narcissist is constantly thinking about themselves in the sense that they're such hot shit, blowing all of their talents and assets out of proportion. But in both cases, this is still a person who is spending most of their time thinking about themselves. My belief is that you are meant to feel sympathy and empathy for Elizabeth in some way. You're meant to see her as someone who is hurting, and that's meant to make us feel her pain on a human-to-human level. Even though our lives might not be just like her life, we're not so different in the fact that, at our core, we are also just souls in a fragile mortal body who yearn to be loved. Elizabeth is a victim, and yet many will say that that can't be possible when she's the villain. The person responsible for making Elizabeth a victim is Elizabeth. However, I think one of the most powerful things about this movie is that it forces you to confront this distinction. And what better way to represent that than to create another self, and to watch those two selves try to destroy each other. By seeing Sue try to kill Elizabeth and Elizabeth try to kill Sue, knowing that they will both die because they are one being, we start to see why it is so possible that someone can still be a victim even if the only person hurting them is themselves. The presence of self-infliction is not an absence of the wound. Elizabeth is still a suffering human being who meets her tragic demise, and the fact that she did it to herself does not undermine the fact that it still happened. I'm always a bit dubious whenever there's some kind of traumatic accident before all the crazy shit happens in a movie, because the inclusion of that accident makes it a lot easier for someone to come up with the fan theory that the character actually died or got put in a coma in that accident, and nothing that happens after that is real. I don't know, maybe I still have Beetlejuice brain from my last video, since the characters in that did die in a car accident early on in the film. I sort of wish it wasn't in the movie for this reason, since I don't think it's necessary. The fact that she got in that horrible wreck and she's miraculously perfectly unharmed makes it even more plausible that she died. But still, that's not my theory because I think that would be a little annoying. Granted, this scene is where she encounters the nurse who introduces her to the substance, and the introduction of the substance is necessary, but I'm just saying it could have been a lot of different things. She didn't have to be in a hospital for this to happen. I guess it might as well be this because it could really be any situation, but I think it would make the script slightly more streamlined if it was some situation which was a little more mundane and incidental. A car crash like that just seems like too significant and brutal of an event for it to not play a major role in the story. So for her to get in a crash like that, and then in literally the very next scene she doesn't have a scratch on her, I can see someone watching this and being like, well, alright, what was the point of that? I also kind of raised my eyebrow at the inclusion of this nurse dude being how she gets introduced to the substance, because first of all, that was quite presumptuous of him. He never exchanges so much as 2 words with her, but he merely knows that she's a 50-year-old celebrity who started crying when the doctor mentioned her birthday, and then the nurse was like, say no more, I know exactly what's going on here. Like, bro, she basically just had a near-death experience. That would be enough to make her feel a little shaken up. Maybe she started crying when he said happy birthday just because she's like, yeah, some birthday this was, huh? Imagine that Elizabeth Sparkle was a woman with a perfectly healthy self-esteem, and she's given a mysterious flash drive by Nurse Mogface, and then she gets home and watches the video on the flash drive. You know, the video that's like, you want to be sexier, don't you? Wouldn't life be better if you were sexy, you pathetic, ugly turd? Elizabeth would be like, well, this is easily the most insulting thing I've ever seen in my life. Who does that little shit think he is to act like he's doing me some kind of favor by giving me this? Fuck that guy. The other reason I don't love that she's given the flash drive in this way is because it brings up distracting questions for me, like, why is he doing that? We later learn that he's a substance user also, so that makes it seem like it's some MLM or something, like this is a pyramid scheme where you buy the product, but then you're also supposed to recruit more people to use the product. If that's the case, why is Elizabeth never prompted to try to recruit anybody else? Or is it just that this dude works for the people who make the substance? It's apparently just a side gig, though, because he also works at this hospital. Is the hospital involved with the people who make the substance? Why is he recruiting her? What benefit is it to him to do this? Does he want to share the joy or the misery? Although the old guy is the one who's miserable, while the young hot nurse is like, this stuff's awesome, you gotta try this. The note he gave her says, it changed my life, but the fact that he has these flash drives to just give out to people makes it seem like he works for them. I love Cozy Shack rice pudding, but I don't have so much as a promotional keychain of theirs to give out to random strangers. What is the motivation of the people who make the substance? Throughout the whole movie, I was kind of waiting to learn more about that, but then it never happened. I was thinking there would be some big reveal where they're able to use the clones for some nefarious purpose. But I guess it's just for money, which is honestly better for the purpose of this story because the allegory here is for the beauty industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry which profits off of making you feel bad enough about yourself that you're willing to mutilate yourself with whatever expensive products they have for you. That's pretty fucking nefarious all on its own, and I have zero trouble believing it, actually. This feels like a good point to bring up the most annoying comment I've heard about this movie, and I've seen it over and over. It's whenever someone says something to the effect of, pretty ironic that Demi Moore would star in this movie when it looks like she's probably had some work done herself. And they're always so smug about it, as if they've pointed out some great hypocrisy which undermines the meaning of the whole movie. Do you actually think that someone who has had plastic surgery is not capable of criticizing the plastic surgery industry? Do you not realize that Demi Moore having plastic surgery probably means more than anything else that she has felt insecurities about her appearance which prompted her to have some work done in the first place? Do you realize how staggeringly few actresses in their 60s look as conventionally attractive as Demi Moore and haven't had work done? Why are you acting like she did something morally shameful when she literally can't win either way? If she didn't, she'd be getting dumbass comments about how much better she used to look. But instead she's getting your dumbass comments about how it's such a shame that she felt the need to get plastic surgery. The movie is not a critique of plastic surgery. The movie is a critique of the systemic ageism and body shaming which plastic surgery profits off of. On the topic of the nurse character, I think it was a good decision to make him a man. This film is very strongly about the uniquely female experience of insane beauty standards, but it is not necessarily in a way that excludes anyone else. Men can feel shame about their bodies also. Anybody can. While we do live in a culture where women are especially held to a ridiculous standard and are especially not allowed to age, and this is a movie about that, the movie is not claiming that this is exclusively a female problem. I think that's important because even though I believe strongly in everything I've said so far about the female experience and misogyny and all of that, I also strongly believe that men are not wholly immune to the harm of body shaming. Height is a big one that comes to mind. Why does everyone act like it's so normal to often mercilessly make fun of a dude for being short as if that's not absolutely, by definition, body shaming? I also think that there's ignorance and harm in acting like it's not possible for men to have eating disorders or exercise addictions and so on. It seems like the substance itself is obviously meant as a metaphor for all of the drastic invasive surgeries that women get to better fit within this idealized, sexualized view of femininity. But consider also that the substance is an injection that you have to obtain secretly and then jab yourself with at home. I'm surprised that nobody has made the comparison between that and steroids. We get the idea that the extreme bimboification of female bodies is a form of mutilation, disfigurement, and body horror. But so is this. All of the dudes that are risking a heart attack from dry scooping too much creatine and buying shady hair loss reversal pills on the internet, is that not also a form of putting your body in danger in an effort to better fit within a certain perceived physical ideal? Is it not also pretty insidious how much that's been normalized, mostly because companies can make the most money if everyone just acts like it's super normal? But anyways, my thoughts here are that yes, these issues disproportionately affect women enough that there does deserve to be a film, and many films, and tons of other art, all specifically focusing on only that part of the conversation. But I simultaneously believe that there's also a conversation to be had about how beauty standards affect every person alive. I don't want to take away from the powerful messages about body shaming inflicted on women specifically in this film by being well, guys suffer too. But I'm glad that this film at least acknowledges that the experience of existing in an aging, imperfect mortal body in a world that is unwelcome to that is a human experience. Oh, Fred. We'll get to this later on, but expect several pages from me about Elizabeth's date with Fred. That scene devastated me. I'm trying not to skip ahead, so even though I have a lot more to say about that character, I'll save it for the next video, and instead only talk about this scene with them. Since we're already on the topic of how this film might be viewed from a male perspective, and this is the next scene after she leaves the doctor's office anyways, let's talk briefly about Fred, the one good guy in this whole movie. I was expecting Fred to be like the Bo Burnham character in Promising Young Woman. I was like, yeah, sure, he seems nice, but I'm guessing we'll probably see otherwise soon enough. That's not what happens, though, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I felt that what happens instead is one of the most powerful and gut-wrenching things in the whole film. But again, I'm gonna resist talking about that for now. I can see male viewers still being upset with Fred's character because they'll be like, well, yeah, the movie isn't saying that literally all men are monsters, but the only man in the movie who isn't a monster is some pathetic loser. I kind of understand that point, especially in this first scene with Fred, since the movie goes out of its way to show how awkward and dorky he is. But at the same time, if I were Elizabeth, I'd go out with Fred way before I'd ever go out with the douchey male models 30 years younger than her that she has casual sex with as Sue. Or, for God's sakes, I would marry Fred before I'd ever willingly breathe the same air as Harvey for 5 minutes. When you first watch this scene, you think that the narrative purpose of it is to further demonstrate yet another humbling situation Elizabeth finds herself in on her 50th birthday. From Elizabeth's perspective, it's like, oh no, this guy is asking me out, as if I'm not wildly out of his league. Oh no, what if I'm not wildly out of his league? Is this how far I've fallen? Do I no longer have any better romantic prospects than Fred? If Elizabeth is interpreting this interaction that way in her mind, she's being a little stuck up and shallow. But Elizabeth is also kind of hurting herself by doing this. Not specifically that she's like self-sabotaging by refusing the advances of this one particular nice guy. Please don't twist what I'm saying here. If Elizabeth doesn't want to go out with someone, that's her choice that she can make without moral judgment, no matter who it is. But viewing this scene as a cinematic representation of some broader point, I think the point here is that Elizabeth is looking for love and validation in all the wrong places. Instead of changing herself, and in fact changing herself in the most violent extreme, to fit within the mold of what someone like Harvey wants, maybe all of her problems could be better solved by simply hanging out with a different crowd of people. The problem is not that she is undesirable or unlovable. The problem is that Harvey in particular is simply an asshole and a moron. The point of this scene with Fred is not that Elizabeth is objectively undesirable now, and she needs this rare special man like Fred, who can look deeper and see the true beauty inside her when nobody else can. The point is that Fred is probably a representation of, like, pretty much every other normal fucking person in the world. He's one of the few normal people we see in this movie, but presumably any normal person would think that Demi Moore is stunning. The problem is that Elizabeth is losing sight of that as she desperately yearns for the approval of the teeny-tiny percentage of people who don't think that. The thin margin of outliers who treat her like dirt because they're people who are deeply fucked in the head. Similar to the car crash opening up the possibility for a sort of sliding door situation where Elizabeth's life could have ended then and there. With this scene, I'm struck with the idea that the movie could have ended right here. Imagine if Fred had told her that she's still the most beautiful girl in the world, and then her response had been like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for saying that. You know, I've been feeling so down on myself today, but hearing that helped bring me back to my senses a little. There's nothing wrong with me. My boss is just a real jerk. You know what? Why am I even working for that ghoul? He can't fire me. I quit. And Fred would probably be a little humorously confused, like, whoa, where did that come from? But he would likely just say something a bit corny and unhip, but still very sweet and sincere. Like, yeah, that's right, you go, girl. And then the movie could end there, instead of ending with a puddle of flesh. But of course, it's not like hearing one nice compliment can magically undo a lifetime of deeply ingrained self-loathing. No amount of anyone telling her she's beautiful could ever convince her that it's true, and that's why Elizabeth keeps pushing and pushing, until there is literally nothing left of herself. Because she's chasing a need which can never truly be satisfied. When she gets home, we see the giant framed photo of herself hanging up in her house, and that comes up later. But before any of that happens, simply the fact that she has this in her home is very weird in itself. Like, alright, yeah, maybe she is a teensy bit self-involved. It's a little funny because you could hardly get more overt as far as visually indicating vanity, but what it also indicates is a lack of photos of any other person. Elizabeth doesn't seem to have anybody she's close to, which is convenient for the purpose of the movie, since when she starts taking the substance, it occurred to me that this is not something that someone could do if they had a family. In order to be a suitable candidate, you have to be someone who lives a very solitary life. You have to be alone. And in fact, I'm sure the substance is playing off of that. Like an abusive relationship, this company benefits from its victims' lack of a support system. The best candidates for the substance are people without others in their life who could likely talk them out of this insane procedure, because they would insist that it's completely unnecessary. Better yet, they would hopefully assure you that they would hate to see you do this to yourself, and that they would personally hate an arrangement where you are someone else every other week, because they love you, and they would miss you during those weeks. The substance preys specifically upon people who have nowhere else to turn and nobody to tell them how wrong all of this is. Which is even sadder when you consider that the whole reason that Elizabeth is willing to go to such great lengths is out of her yearning to be loved. But to her, to be loved is to perform for adoring fans. What value is that kind of love when you have nobody that you feel close to, nobody to share your life with? And I don't just mean, why doesn't Elizabeth have a man? She has nobody. If there was even one friend or family member who was truly involved in Elizabeth's life, her complete disappearance every other week would have probably come up. Since it never does, we can assume that Elizabeth is completely alone. And what's really, really sad is that there is likely a good chance that the reason why Elizabeth has nobody in her life is because she doesn't believe that she is worthy of being loved exactly the way she is. It's easier and safer to push everyone away and isolate than to contend with the possibility of some other person seeing parts of yourself that you believe to be unlovable. I say as I pick my nose. She checks out what's on the flash drive. I'll share a few quick notes on the imagery in the flash drive's promotional video for the substance. With the balls of clay, one is lumpy and misshapen while the other is more perfectly spherical, suggesting that Elizabeth is the lumpy clay while Sue is the pretty smooth clay. As if the words more perfect aren't enough, that's reinforced visually by further conflating the ideas of one body with misshapenness, deformity, and imperfection. Also at the end, when the hands smack the two clay balls together, is that possibly foreshadowing of Monstro Eliza Sue? Or is it just to drive home the point that you are one? Let's look at the commercial for the substance in isolation from the film, and evaluate it from a real-life advertising perspective. Is this a good ad? Is it effective? Would it make consumers want to buy this product? I think this ad is way too ominous and menacing. But of course, there's an interesting meta thing going on here because I say that as someone who knows that they're watching a horror movie, whereas Elizabeth is watching this as someone who doesn't know they're in a horror movie. But still, based on the information presented in this ad and the bleak, edgy, minimalist branding, I think my reaction would still be like, did that guy give me this flash drive because it's part of some weird conceptual art collective he's involved in? There are plenty of ads that are similarly aggressive and being like, you want to be fuckable, don't you? But once it gets to the science, I can't imagine seeing all of that talk of harnessing the power of your cells to create a new organism, and then still having no further questions besides, well, wait a second, but does it really make you more fuckable? I can't imagine anyone seeing this and not being like, that is extremely goddamn terrifying. Keep in mind that this is a branding and marketing route that is sometimes done intentionally and can be effective. It seems counterintuitive, but by making your product seem sort of shadier or more secretive, more hush-hush, you're making it seem more exclusive. This makes it seem like the substance is something only the rich and famous elites have access to. Thus, it can be part of the appeal, especially for someone like Elizabeth, to feel like she belongs to that elite, exclusive few. There is this sort of seductive appeal to feeling like you have access to secret cutting-edge technology not available to the public, even if you know that the reason it's not available to the public is because it's pretty hardcore and even pretty ethically questionable. But I think something else we need to consider about the substance ad is that everywhere you look, there are companies making very similar dubious claims, that their product will make you younger, more beautiful, more perfect. The substance is nothing special in that regard. Sure, the substance differentiates itself somewhat because the claims it makes are so very extreme and outlandish in terms of how the product actually works. There are countless products which claim that they'll make you look more youthful and beautiful, but probably not too many that claim to literally create another self out of your own DNA matrix. And yet, look at especially sketchy products on Amazon or Wish, and you'll soon see that a lot of this snake oil is being peddled with comparably miraculous and nonsensical claims. I think the biggest reason why this ad probably wouldn't work is simply because people like Elizabeth would see it and be like, yeah, right. But that's what I find so interesting about this as someone who is interested in the psychology of advertising, the concept of misinformation and misleading, as well as the concept of suspension of disbelief. We, the audience, know roughly the same amount of information about the substance as Elizabeth does. That works so well for establishing intrigue and anticipation because we are figuring out what it is and how it works at the same time that she does. We and Elizabeth are both navigating a situation in which we must interpret the clues and messages given to us with meticulous thought and care by an external entity. In our case, we're watching a movie with a strong mystery hook where the filmmaker is slowly revealing the information we need to know. In Elizabeth's case, she is trying to interpret the frustratingly cryptic messages of a shady organization that are trying to play off her insecurities to entice her to buy their product. They're trying to do this all while keeping it vague enough that they don't deter her. If they were entirely upfront with her about exactly what the substance does in explicit, unambiguous detail, they wouldn't have anybody buying their product. Because in execution, what it does is so obviously fucking terrifying. So they have to spin the facts and make it seem sexier and more intriguing, which is exactly what they're doing in their ad. I think the ad is great satire because that's exactly what a lot of companies have to do because the reality of their product is not sexy enough for anyone to want to buy it. So it all creates this fascinating effect where we as the audience know that something bad is going to happen, so we know to interpret everything they say as an unsettling omen. It becomes a situation where we interpret the opposite of everything they say because of our vantage point as a viewer in a theater watching a film. When they say younger, more beautiful, more perfect, we don't have any sense of, oh, that sounds nice, tell me more about that. We know that what they really mean as the narrative unfolds is older, uglier, more flawed. Elizabeth doesn't have that same privilege. She has to interpret this merely as a skeptical but also desperate consumer. She's smart enough to think, that sounds a little too good to be true. But she's also getting to the point where she doesn't know what other options she has anymore. And of course, another crucial difference between the information that the viewer has in relation to the information that the protagonist has is that the stakes are a lot higher for the protagonist. If we're expecting one thing from this movie and then it turns out to not be what we expected in a way that we don't like, all we've lost is the price of a movie ticket and a few hours out of our day. We are not literally injecting this movie into our veins. Although I love this movie so much, I kind of wish I could. For Elizabeth, the stakes of making these decisions without all of the necessary information is far more severe. She is putting something into her body knowing that it probably does something inconceivably drastic, but she does so based only on the blind hope that it will be a good outcome. She does it because she feels that desperate times call for drastic measures. But think about the vulnerability of that situation she puts herself in. I've never done anything close to this, but shit, I can understand it somewhat as someone who is the too much gene and often overdoes it, but who is also a very anxious person who has plenty of harrowing panic attacks based on the fear that I've done too much of something, and now I have to exist in my body and ride out the consequences until it passes. Have you ever had a little too much caffeine? Have you ever gotten a little too high? Have you ever picked at a pimple too aggressively? Have you ever left the Nair on for a little too long and then you have to deal with terrible burns for a couple days after that? These are minor examples, but think about the risk undertaken by anyone who makes a decision to go under the knife. They all do it in the hope that it will make them look much better. But we've all seen that puffy, uncanny look of a face which has gotten a particularly unflattering filler in it. Nobody who decides to get those surgeries knows that that's how it's going to turn out. They know it's a risk, but it's a risk they're willing to take based on merely the blind hope that the outcome will be good. And that's not even the worst thing that can happen. Literally any time a person goes under anesthesia, there's a small percentage of a chance that they will die. It happens. People literally die not because anything went wrong with the surgery, but simply because of a dosage error or a bad reaction to the anesthetic. Not to mention, you are increasing your risk of infections or anything else that could possibly go wrong. I have no judgment towards anyone who gets a boob job, but to me personally, I'm probably never going to get a boob job purely out of the fear that I would really hate to die due to a completely avoidable cause, all because I wanted bigger bazongas. I think it was such a good choice to make this very commercial such an important feature of the trailers for this movie. It's difficult to market a movie based on such a high-concept original idea, because you want the viewer to be intrigued and have some idea of what they're getting themselves into, but you don't want to give too much away. I had seen the trailers before watching this, and it immediately seemed like exactly my kind of movie, and so it was one of my most anticipated releases of this year. But I was still basing that on only a vague understanding of the general concept. What I realized is that I was basing a lot of that understanding not on information from the trailer or the setup of the film, but instead on my expectations from similar fictional concepts. Obviously, Fargeat doesn't know what movies and TV shows I specifically have seen and what pop culture references I turn to specifically, but it's kind of crazy to me how perfectly my exact set of flawed assumptions lended to an enthralling revelatory effect every time one of those flawed assumptions were corrected. To give an example, I realized that I was basing my understanding of the substance off of Death Becomes Her, and so I somehow had my blinders on and saw only what fit within that mental framework. I didn't think too hard about the stitches on the back in the poster, or the one egg coming out of the other egg. There were probably even more explicit explanations of how this all works that didn't register with me for some reason. My understanding was that the substance would work by morphing Demi Moore's body into Margaret Qualley's body, and so when she has that scene we've all seen plenty of times before, where she's in a new body and she's looking at herself in the mirror and touching her face like, oh my god, is this really me? It's a little weird that I've now mentioned Freaky Friday 2 videos in a row, but it felt kind of like that. It felt uninspired, but also even sort of toothless and hokey, because we're very familiar with this trope where someone looks at themselves in a mirror and touches their face because they're in disbelief of the new body that they're in. But then the camera pans over, and we see the lifeless husk of Elizabeth's body with a gruesome gash down her spine. When I saw that, I audibly went, oh shit. So that's my example of what I'm talking about. I have no way of knowing how much of this is intentional, and if it's even possible for it to be intentional, when Fargeat has no way of anticipating what particular assumptions and misinterpretations I will make as a viewer. But all throughout this film, there just kept continually being moments where the effect was so palpable and intense. And I believe the reason the effect of these moments are so effective is because of how perfectly it made me believe things were a certain way, and then the movie said, no, not quite. To me, this is different than a movie that is full of shocking twists and turns. This is more interesting to me because usually these moments are not exactly twists. I probably should have known that a new separate clone emerges out of the original body. That's not information that was deliberately withheld from the audience. It was simply left vague enough that the film allowed for an oh shit moment like the one that I had to happen. The movie didn't force it upon me by deliberately trying to mislead me just so it could drop some bombshell revelation on me, all for the sake of having a crazy twist. Instead, the movie keeps the information vague and guides me along with a little trail of breadcrumbs, until even that structure becomes a predictable pattern, so the film then switches it up and keeps things interesting by switching into the very unvague and unsubtle sledgehammer twists and turns. I kept gradually gaining more and more information about how exactly the substance works, making little adjustments and distinctions to my mental model of it, step by step until eventually I understood. And that's what made it such an extraordinarily fun viewing experience. I've spoken in both of my previous videos about my love for figuring out how high-concept sci-fi fantasy things work within the context of their fictional world, so this movie is fun for me on that level. But typically it isn't also the case that each little revelation about the functionality of this thing also knocks the wind out of me. In my opinion, there is literally no purer form of audience engagement and immersion that you can hope to achieve with a piece of art than to have them hanging on every word, trying to figure out every little nuance, and then each time one of those little nuances does become apparent to them, that just makes them lock into the viewing experience even more, because they're so anxious and eager to see what happens next in light of this new discovery. I don't think you can get more engaging than that. And you could loosely apply that model to something like a good romantic drama or something else, but for a sci-fi horror movie like this one, I think there's no argument about it. The best possible effect that you can hope to achieve with your film would be to have your audience on the edge of their seat, hanging on to every word in sheer anticipation to see what happens next. This movie is exceptional and important. Oh shit. What happened to the mic? I might have to re-record that part. This movie is exceptional and important to me because I believe that its message is deeply resonant and pertinent. It would be a disservice to this film and to Coralie Fargeat to not honor that message in our commentaries about this. But I also think that by doing so, we might be unintentionally adding some little asterisk, some specialization to this film, which may prevent it from finding its deserved place in the canon of truly great cinema, period. We should be careful not to create this discourse surrounding it where it becomes overly specialized as a feminist film dealing with feminist issues. It is that, but let's not forget that it is also a triumph of sci-fi horror. I feel it's genuinely one of the best sci-fi horror movies I've ever seen in my life. Horror and sci-fi, and of course definitely satire, are genres that have been heavily imbued with social commentary since their very beginning. That's not anything new. But because identity politics play such a strong role in our lives today, I fear we may be doing great films like this a disservice. Why? I fear we may be doing great films a disservice by placing them into these little boxes of identity politics, even though we often do so with very good intentions. Myself and many others are championing this movie as a feminist masterpiece. When we say that, we mean it as a very good thing. But the substance is also just a masterpiece, period. Alright, let's get back to the movie. I've talked a lot about hypothetical reactions that Elizabeth might have had to seeing this substance ad, and I've usually done so to be like, wouldn't it be funny if that had happened? Or, I'm surprised that this didn't happen. But to Elizabeth's credit, it seems like any number of these hypotheticals I've proposed might have actually been her reaction, based on the way she kind of scoffs and shakes her head and then throws it away. She decides to go get drunk at a bar, and again we see fine food and beverage being depicted through the lens of revulsion and yuck, because something about the olive in her martini getting stabbed feels like it's an eyeball or something. Demi Moore gives such an incredible performance in this film. Later on, she goes batshit, and the fearlessness and brutality of her performance is impossible to ignore. But I'm also impressed with all the subtlety of these quieter moments. There's not much dialogue in the film, and most of the story is told through these private moments where she's all by herself. And yet we understand every moment of what's happening and every detail of what Elizabeth is experiencing internally. At this point in the film, there are several minutes of Elizabeth reflecting on things, making the decision to order the substance, and then going to get the substance and mentally psyching herself up to try it. I'll mention a few little things that stuck out to me, but really I think most of these last 5 minutes of Act 1 can be explained pretty simply by saying that Demi Moore really killed it in this role. For those of you wondering about the symbolism of the snow globe, I do have a theory, but I'll save that for part 2, where I feel that symbol is given further contextualization, which makes it more interesting. As far as her actual decision to order, I can imagine that some people might have felt that this wasn't properly justified. Much like the dramatic turn of Paul in Dune Part 2 when he decides to go south, and people complained that that decision came out of nowhere. I will also defend this one based on the argument that this shift in character motivation was established, but it's based on lots of little things adding up that finally brought the character to a point where they were like, fuck it, I'm just gonna do it. And I would argue that this is actually more realistic to human behavior, even if it's less cinematically satisfying than some big plot event that radically changes them. The fact that Elizabeth makes this decision after a long night out of getting totally wasted honestly isn't even that important of a factor. This is sad, but I think there's some connection here with this decision to take the substance and suicidality. I think that parallel becomes increasingly clear once we see that taking the substance becomes for her not so much even an effort to maximize the amount of Sue, but rather to minimize the amount of Elizabeth. I'm probably the most hardcore Severance fan out there, and it seems like I'm apparently going to keep finding some way to mention it in every single video, but oh well. I was reminded of how Mark's motivation for choosing to do the severance procedure is because he's grieving and horribly depressed. And so for him, the whole appeal of something that splits your conscious life in half is simply because that will allow him to not be conscious half of the time. He's trying to escape and avoid as much of the experience of living as he possibly can without actually killing himself. I think it's kind of similar with Elizabeth, although here there's an even greater theme of self-erasure. It's not only that she is miserable and wants to cut out as much living as possible, it's equally, or perhaps even more so, about the fact that Elizabeth hates herself, which we see manifested as an actual violent urge towards her own body, which is sometimes how self-loathing can feel. Sometimes self-loathing is not merely, I'm my own worst enemy, why am I so awful? It's like you look at yourself with the animosity of looking at some other person whom you just totally despise. Like if you hated someone so intensely that you would even fantasize about seeing them get beat up, or take pleasure in knowing that they got ran over by a bus or something. It's violent, ugly, visceral hatred. But that's how Elizabeth feels about herself, and in this film we actually see those feelings played out allegorically. All of this is to say, I think her decision to take the substance is partially because she has reached the point where she is willing to accept the risks, because she doesn't even have the will to live anymore. If it goes horribly wrong, and even if it kills her, she figures, oh well. In fact, she might even be subconsciously trying to punish herself and her body. Which brings me to my realization about the branding of the substance. I mentioned earlier that I find it a little odd that the company making the substance wouldn't be trying harder to make it seem more appealing. It almost seems like they're doing the opposite. All of the branding is bleak and vaguely menacing. It's inconvenient to order. The fact that she has to go get it by going to some sketchy-looking alleyway as a woman by herself is so scary. That alone would deter the absolute hell out of me. Even the fact that the door won't go all the way up and she has to crouch down to get in there. I think that's also meant to evoke Alice in Wonderland or Willy Wonka or something, though, crouching through this small little door into an alternate world. But it's also like this prim, fancy lady has to humble herself and get her nice coat dirty and crawl on her hands and knees to access this stuff. But the real red flag here is the fucking format of the substance itself. The liquid in the syringe is the most toxic, fluorescent yellow-green color you can imagine. It looks like that's a color that insects or plants or animals would use as a warning to predators to say, hey, don't fuck with me, I'm poisonous. That's the color we think of when we think of hazardous waste. There could not be any liquid which more emphatically screams, do not put this in your body. I'm sure it's also a nod to Reanimator, but to me this is the more interesting and meaningful thing to discuss about the color of the activator liquid. Let's consider also the fact that you have to use a syringe. I remember when I was a kid and first learned about drugs like heroin, and it was so inconceivable to me why anybody would ever use a needle on themselves intentionally. What could be more squeamish and unpleasant than a needle? Why would someone ever possibly do that to themselves? And at some point in my life I realized that that's merely just another indication of the lengths that someone is willing to go to if they're addicted to heroin. At a certain point they'd probably inject it directly into their eyeballs if that was the only way to get the relief they so desperately crave. And then it hit me. That's the reason why everything surrounding the substance seems so deliberately like a huge red flag, begging you to come to your senses and please, please, please do not fucking do this. Because none of that matters to someone who is desperate enough. The fact that Elizabeth is now standing in her bathroom, holding a syringe, injecting highlighter juice into her body because of a flash drive given to her by some mysterious stranger, that she had to mail order and then crawl through a dirty alleyway in a bad part of town to obtain is exactly the point. All of it is to show the depths of her desperation. Elizabeth, like many of us, has been made to resent her own body, her own self, with such a fathomless, soul-crushing depth that she is willing to do quite literally whatever it takes to escape the hell of being Elizabeth.